Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Illinois webinar addressing the fair tax with special guest panelist Ralph Martire, Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. My name is Jean Pierce. I'm with the League of Women Voters Issues and Advocacy Committee. Tonight's program is being recorded. It'll be available through the League of Women Voters of Illinois Facebook page. While our speaker is talking, we invite you to click on chat at the bottom of your screen and type in your own questions. We'll try to ask as many of your questions as time permits. We're going to begin with a welcome from Allison Hout, League of Women Voters of Illinois Board President.
Thank you, Jean. Welcome, everyone. We are pleased to have Ralph Martire and each of you here with us for this evening's important discussion. My name is Allison Hout, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. For close to 50 years, the League of Women Voters of Illinois has been a proponent of the graduated rate tax, or fair tax. The fair tax is a necessity to give our state the financial ability to fund all levels of education and other critical social and human services in an equitable and just manner for all of Illinois. It's quite simple. Our league positions are deeply rooted in research, social justice, and equity. We are long-term advocates for the provision of and access to basic human services.
You're muted.
Yeah, Allison, you're muted.
There's been technical trouble all day in this room. Okay, the League has championed many efforts to amend our state constitution to provide for a more equitable structure, one that takes into account disparate incomes and differing abilities to pay. The state entity must have healthy fiscal policy to fund the basics, the core services which we all need, including healthcare and public safety. The events of this year, 2020, have highlighted the deep and painful inequities in our systems nationwide. And here at home, this has magnified the problems in funding that our state has faced for years. What we need to have are strong community conversations about valuing all people equally. This is about investing in a future for everyone, for each of us. And each of us can be the difference, a difference in another person's understanding of the need for and the benefits of the fair tax. You, each of you, are a trusted source to family, friends, and folks in your community. You can be effective in creating yes votes for fair tax. Sharing your understanding and just a few simple facts, that's the key. We are now so close to the goal. Please use what you learned tonight to be the difference and get this across the finish line.
Thank you, Allison. Ralph Martire is a familiar face to many League members. He's Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, a bipartisan 501c3 think tank committed to ensuring that state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies are fair and just and promote opportunity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income class. He's also the Rublock Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. I'm pleased that he's presenting a program for this evening.
Great. Well, am I on now, Jean?
You sure are.
Well, thanks, and thanks for the introduction. It's always great to work with the League of Women Voters. My organization's actually been around since the year 2000, and I think we started collaborating with the League in the year 1999, just before we got started. I mean, that's how long our relationship goes. So I'm gonna just tell you right now, as sort of the, the spoiler alert, that the fair tax is really good tax policy. And and the failure of the state of Illinois to have a graduated rate income tax is really a tax policy failure. It also happens to be a failure from a fairness standpoint when you look at differing incomes and how income growth gets distributed in the modern economy. But, and this is going to surprise people, this particular version of the fair tax, and in fact, most graduated rate income tax proposals, are actually good economic policy during a recession. Now, why would all that be? Well, I'm going to get into that in this presentation. First, let's start with, first slide, please. Let's start with the state's budget for this fiscal year. And this is how the state of Illinois will spend your money. If you go to the very top line on this graphic, what you will see is the state's going to spend about $42.9 billion this year. And we break those expenditures into their two component parts. The hard costs, these are the things the state has to spend by law. There's not a lot of discretion here. There's either a statute or a contract that requires the money to go out the door. So of that 42 billion, 14.8 are hard costs. And you can see there's only a few categories there: debt service to third parties like banks and bondholders. There's the statutory requirement that the state make a specified pension contribution every year under the pension ramp legislation that was passed back in 1995. There are other statutory transfers out similar to the pension ramp transfer out that just say, look, this money, when it comes in, has to go to the road fund or the Medicaid funds or local government distributive fund, et cetera. And those will total about $2 billion this year. And then there's the contractual obligation on health insurance for state workers. That's about just under $2 billion. The third category there, this is where the state has a little bit of discretion. It's how they vote to spend your money on current services. And what I'd like to highlight there, you see it in big purple, 96% of what they will spend this year, 96 cents out of every dollar that goes to public services, will go to one of only four things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. Now, education, that's writ large. There's three subcategories. There's early childhood, there's K-12, and there's higher ed. But the bottom line, that's all education. So the state is spending our money on pretty good priorities. I'm going to highlight a couple of things because they're going to matter during that presentation. The penultimate line there, unspent appropriations. The dollar amount that you see next to each of these service categories isn't what's ultimately going to be spent in many of them. Why? They've decided that of what they've appropriated, they will not spend $1 billion, 1.062 billion. They just haven't allocated those cuts yet. So when you see a line in the current budget for any service that you care about, that's a maximum potential appropriation, and it is subject to being cut when these unspent appropes are applied. So the net expenditures on services are $28 billion. And the truth of the matter is we're underfunding most of these from a demographically driven demand standpoint, number one. And despite the fact that we're underfunding most of them, we can't afford our current service levels because our tax policy doesn't work in the modern economy. So next slide, please. How bad is the state's fiscal system? I said we can't afford the current level of services we're providing, so where's the proof? Here's the proof. This is a walk down of our current deficit situation. So go to the very top line there, and you see the projected revenue for the year sounds good. It's $42.9 billion. They're going to overall spend $42.9 billion. That very much sounds like a balanced budget, right? However, let's run through what the real expenditures will be to see what's actually going on. So the first thing you take out of your revenue for the year are the hard costs, the things that the state has to pay by law, by statute or contract. That's $14.8 billion. So take that out and go to the second line. We have $28.1 billion left to spend on services, which explains why there is a $1 billion unspent appropriation line, right? They're going to spend only 28.1, not the 29.1 that they authorized. So we have 28.1 billion in revenue. However, out of that revenue, we have to pay the bills that are left over from last year, and that's going to be $8.4 billion. This is called your carry forward deficit. It's really the unpaid bills that are left over at the end of one fiscal year that carry into the next fiscal year. And by state law, these bills have to be paid before the end of the second fiscal year in which they were incurred. So they become a drag on current revenue. So let's take that out. So that leaves only, go down to the third step, 19 billion in revenue. We are going to spend 28.1, meaning the deficit stays right around 8.4 billion in unpaid bills. However, the deficit this year is much worse. Why? COVID-19. So COVID-19 really drove down the revenue that they anticipated to be receiving this year, and it will impact next year as well. By how much? Well, this year, around 5 billion. So the way they covered that, in that $42 billion of revenue you see in the very top line here, there's $5 billion of borrowing from the feds. Now, that's great because it supports current services this year. The problem is that revenue certainly isn't available next year. And in fact, these loans will have to be repaid over a 2 to 3 year period. So the bottom line is the deficit that's actually going to carry forward from the end of the current fiscal year we're living in, fiscal year 2021, into fiscal year 2022 next year is $13.4 billion. Now, how significant is that? If the state just wanted to spend the exact same amount on current services next year that it is spending this year in nominal dollars, not even increasing them for inflation, it will be short of the revenue needed to do that by some 47%. So that's a pretty meaningful deficit, and that's a pretty big hole. Now, then the question becomes, how did we get here? And aside from COVID-19, we've had what's called a structural deficit. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic depiction of what our structural deficit looks like going forward, okay? All it is, it's a pretty simple calculation. Ours happens to have been peer reviewed by 4 different PhD economists, including the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, D.C. Is you start, go to the far left-hand corner of that graphic. You start with the assumption the state has an actually balanced, real for sure balanced budget in fiscal year 2019. It did not. It had a deficit of around 8 billion, but let's assume that it did. Its revenues and its expenditures were equal. If you just adjust for historic rates of inflation, you assume a normal economy, and you assume no changes in law, so no additional programs, literally no expansion of a program, doing nothing more down the road from a public service standpoint than precisely what they're doing today, will your revenue growth under your current tax policy be sufficient to maintain your current expenditures into the future, plus pay off your debts? The answer is a resounding no. So the yellow greeny line at the top there, that shows you our projected growth in costs for funding public services, as well as our debt service. There's no projection there. We just know what the payments are, and so we put them in. The red line underneath it shows you the projected growth in revenue. The gap between revenue growth and cost growth is the structural deficit. Illinois had one of these for decades, literally since at least the late 60s, early 70s. That's the first time the University of Illinois identified it for the state. And this really explains why we have so many other fiscal problems in Illinois. And when I say other problems, I mean, in addition to our ongoing deficits at the state level, the reason why our property taxes are high, the reason why our pensions are underfunded. Why do I say that? Well, when you have a structural deficit, there are really only 2 ways to solve it in a sustainable fashion. Number one, you can just cut all your expenditures, your service expenditures, right down to your revenue line every year. Well, if you are an elected official and you are really severely cutting education, health, social services, and public safety every year, you're not going to get reelected. So politically, that's a tough thing to do. Believe it or not, the other solution is equally, if not more difficult to do from a political standpoint. And that is you could raise your taxes up to your cost line. Tax increases are a politically challenging thing to accomplish. So both parties, this has been a bipartisan problem, have wanted to avoid dealing with the structural deficit the way you should, and have instead resulted to sort of irresponsible practices to cover up this gap in revenue growth versus cost growth over time. Those 2 practices, number one, hey, let's push the primary obligation for funding K-12 education away from us here at the state and our state tax revenue and down to local property tax revenue. And that's why your property taxes are high. Number 2, hey, we have this long-term obligation to fund pensions. Let's just not put in what we're supposed to put in to fund the benefits being earned. That's called the normal cost. It's determined by actuaries. Let's just not put it in. Instead, write an IOU to the pension systems, pay them back someday, and take the money that should have gone to the pensions and use it to hide some of the structural deficit to cover the cost of providing some services we otherwise would have to cut because we don't have the revenue. That's called borrowing to spend. It is highly irresponsible. And in Illinois, it is precisely why we are in a really difficult position with our pensions today. We borrowed aggressively against our pension contribution for decades to hide the structural deficit. And in 1995, when they passed that repayment plan, the ramp, they backloaded the payments in an unaffordable, unattainable way to really kick the can down the road. And we are in the middle of that backloading. So this structural deficit is really the driver of all of our key fiscal problems in Illinois. So then the question becomes really what created or primarily created the structural deficit? Is it overspending on services, so they should be cut? Or is it bad tax policy? Well, next slide, please. These are the kind of graphics the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability loves, and most people, their eyes roll into the back of the heads when they see it because there's so many numbers crammed onto the page. But really, it's okay. Stay with me on this. Go to the far left-hand column here. That's what the state spent on education, healthcare, social services, and public safety, i.e. those things that consume over 90% of the state general fund spending on services, way back in fiscal year 2000 under Republican Governor George Ryan. The second column right next to it just adjusts those expenditures for inflation and puts them in current 2020 dollars. So just go to the top line there, K-12 education. We spent $4.6 billion on that in nominal dollars in fiscal year 2000. To just be spending the exact same amount today after inflation in current dollars, we'd have to be spending 8.2. Those are equal numbers on an inflation adjusted basis. Okay. The third and fourth columns then, the third column is just what our current budget really is. And then the fourth and fifth column are we in real terms after inflation spending more or less, dollar amounts, and then percentage. So I'm going to go to the very bottom corner right. Today in Illinois, we are going to spend 20.5% less collectively on education, health, social services, and public safety than we did in the year 2000 after you adjust for inflation. Spending isn't driving our problem. What have we increased? And the answer is the top two lines here. So K-12 education. That is up by a whopping 1.39% over 2 decades. If you're doing the math at home, that's 0.07% or something like that per year. It's really nothing to crow about, number one. Number two, literally all that growth came in the last 3 years. So when the state passed its new school funding formula, the Evidence-Based Formula for Student Success Act, in that formula, it set a target for the state to increase K-12 funding on a year-to-year basis by at least $300 million from the prior year. They did that each of the first 3 years of the bill. So in 2018, 2019, and 2020, the state increased its K-12 expenditures by $300 million each year. So that's $900 million over 3 years. And it's only because of that we're spending more on an inflation adjusted basis today than we did back in the year 2000. Literally, if I made this presentation in 2019, it would still be a negative. All right. That sounds good. However, we're not coming anywhere near meeting need in education. The brilliant thing about the evidence-based funding formula is it ties the cost of education to the state funding cost, only covering the expenditures needed to provide those educational services that have a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing student achievement over time. So it only funds what works. So it's a great model because it says if you put this investment in and the investment is applied to these evidence-based practices, student learning, student outcomes will improve. They'll go up. The bad news is, based on the evidence model, Illinois is underfunding K-12 education today by $7 billion. $7 billion. That's so big. I mean, look, our total funding level for K-12 this year is scheduled to be 8.3. It'd almost have to double it to catch up to what the evidence says is needed. So while it's great that in the last 3 years, the state made a bit of an investment more in its school-age children, it's got a long way to go. Second line there, early childhood. Now that's had a very meaningful increase. And Illinois actually, compared to the rest of the nation, has been making a pretty good investment here. And in real terms, we're up by 81%. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. Our total appropriation, as you could see for this year in that third column, is going to be about $544 million. Now that's good, but it doesn't come anywhere meeting demand, which is over $3 billion in the state of Illinois. Once again, even in the two areas where we've made a bit of an increase, we are still not coming anywhere near satisfying demographically driven demand. Now go to the next education column, higher ed. In fiscal year 2000, the state funded higher ed with $2.1 billion. Ignore the inflation adjustment column, the second column. Go right to this year's budget, 2021. This year, the state's going to put less into higher education in nominal dollars, only $1.9 billion, than it did 2 decades ago, not even adjusting for inflation. When you adjust for inflation, the cut is approaching 50% in real terms. That's had some very significant consequences. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here's a graphic that will show you sort of the consequence of underfunding higher ed and how meaningful it is. Go to the far left-hand column. In fiscal year 2002, state general fund transfers to higher ed, so the appropriation that came out of the general fund, covered 72% of the cost of a student attending a public university in our state. University income funds, which is a fancy term for tuition and fees, student costs. Tuition and fees only cover 28% of the cost of a student attending a public university in our state. Then in 2004, Rod Blagojevich got the brilliant idea that he should start cutting higher ed funding because he didn't want to raise taxes. And so that's what he chose to do, because if he could make a bad decision, Rod almost sought it out and did it intentionally. But he started cutting significantly in 2004. And now go to 2019, the last year for which I have data for tuition and fees. By 2019, state general funding of higher ed was only covering 33% of the cost of a student attending a public university, whereas tuition and fees were covering 67%. That has made higher education at the public level in our state very, very difficult for middle income, lower income families to afford. It's had a disproportionately negative impact on Black and brown communities. And literally our growth in public tuition costs over this sequence has exceeded the national rate of growth in tuition costs for public universities by over 50 percentage points over this period. We're now an outlier here, and it's because of the significant disinvestment in higher ed that's been driven by our structural deficit, that is our tax policy that doesn't support our current level of services, even though our current level of services are not sufficient to meet demographically driven demand. Next slide, please. So I did tell you that to sort of conceal the structural deficit and work through it for years, the state opted to do a couple of things. One of them was to push the primary obligation for funding public education away from state taxes and down to local property taxes. And so here's your proof. Illinois is the red bar here. The national average is the blue. Go to the comparison on the far left. Now, on average, a state covers 45% of the cost of public education from local property taxes. In Illinois, local property taxes cover 67% of the cost of education. Go to the middle comparison. On average, state covers 46% of the cost of public education from state-based revenue like the income and sales taxes. In Illinois, we only cover 24%. And then you can see the federal government covers the rest in the last comparison. So we're the outlier in both cases. Illinois relies more on local property taxes to fund K-12 education than any other state in America, and Illinois relies less on state-based tax resources to fund public education than any other state in America. Now, this is why we have one of the most inequitable school funding systems, or at least had until our new formula got passed in the country. Our new formula is changing, that it's investing primarily in low income districts. So 90% of that new money has gone precisely to the bottom tier of districts from a funding standpoint. That's the good news. The bad news is we still have pretty much tied the quality of public education a child's going to get to the property wealth of the community in which the kid lives. And so that's highly inequitable. So from an educational funding standpoint, that's a bad idea. From a tax policy standpoint, it's a very unfair way to tax people. How do I know this? Next slide, please. So here you could see, going back to 1990 and through 2018, the most recent data I have for property taxes. Property taxes, after you take out the impact of inflation, so in real terms, grew by almost 70% in Illinois. That's that orangey bar. Median income over this same sequence only grew by 11%. So you have your property tax burden in Illinois growing at 6 to 7 times the rate of growth in income for most people. I mean, it's a very harsh tax burden. It takes a lot of the income, lower income working family, middle income working family, seniors on fixed incomes. This is a particularly tough way to tax them because your property tax doesn't care about your ability to pay it. It just goes up every year. And let's face it, you're paying your property taxes out of your income. So if your income's not growing at the rate of the growth of the property tax revenue, this is dipping into your household budget. It's just the truth. And we're doing this in Illinois because the state has inadequate resources to fund education appropriately, and it has inadequate resources to do that because its tax policy doesn't work. Next slide, please. Also a bad way to tax businesses. So a lot of people say, well, you know, maybe this fair tax is a bad idea, it might hurt small businesses. And I don't know what data they're looking at, but no data that I've ever seen. So this is an Ernst & Young study that lays out what businesses pay in taxes in Illinois. What is by far and away the biggest portion of their tax burden in Illinois? It's property taxes. 45.9% of all taxes businesses pay in Illinois are property taxes. Then go to the middle of this graphic. Corporate income tax is just 4%. It's next to nothing. Go a little further down, the individual income tax. Why is that here? Quite a significant number of businesses, in fact, most of them, are exempt from ever paying the corporate income tax. The only kind of business that does is what's called a C corporation. S corporations, partnerships, limited liability companies, they're exempt from paying corporate level income tax. However, the owners of those businesses pay personal income taxes on their profits based on their percentage ownership. So if I owned 50% or half of the stock of an S corporation that made $100 in profit, 50% of $100 is $50. That $50 of profit would show up as income to me on my personal income tax return, and I'd pay personal income taxes on it under state law. So even that's a minuscule burden. But the big killer is property taxes. Well, why are property taxes high? I just told you, and we just ran through it. So net, our lousy tax revenue system at the state level that has a structural deficit built into it is created an inequitable school funding system and created an onerous property tax burden for not just people, but for businesses. Next slide, please. All right. Then I said the other thing that the state does to hide the structural deficit is underfund the pensions. Well, they did that for decades and decades and decades. And then in 1995, the General Assembly got together with Governor Edgar, and they decided to pass a pension ramp. And they called it a ramp because they created a 50-year time period. This is the ramp period. They ramped up the payments. That's why they use the word ramp. For repaying what was borrowed from the pension systems to fund services. And it was borrowed, not literally taken out of the pension systems. They just didn't put in what they should have, took the money that should have gone to cover normal costs, diverted that to hide the structural deficit. Okay, so this is the picture of the ramp going forward, what's left of it from 2019 through 2045. What I've done, you add those two bars together, that's the total payment the state has to make to its pension systems every year under the ramp. I've broken the two payments out by their component parts. The pinky light color at the bottom That's the normal cost of funding benefits being earned by workers. That's your benefit cost. And you could see that's a very small part of the payment being made, number one. And number two, it's a declining part. Why? In 2010, they passed a law that created a second tier of public employee benefits that is significantly lower in value than the tier it replaced, tier one. So you see that the normal cost not only doesn't increase over time, it decreases. But look at the growth in the debt service payment. I mean, that's outrageous. I'm pretty good at tax policy. I teach a master's course at tax policy at Roosevelt University. You should all sign up and take it. It's a really fun class. And what wouldn't be fun about taking an entire master's level class talking about budgets and fiscal policy? Got you all excited now. I can just sense that. Okay, eyes are rolling back into their heads. So the bottom line is I can't design a tax system that grows like this. You look at that ramp. It's a ski slope. There's no way, and to give you an example of how ridiculous, how unaffordable this ramp is, between fiscal year 20 and 2021, so at the lower part of the ramp, way down here on the far left-hand side, just the debt service portion of the ramp grew by $500 million. Total general fund revenue over that 1 year period, fiscal year 20 to 21, was 106 million. And that's without the impact of COVID-19. That's as if COVID-19 never happened. So this debt service growth literally is 5 times greater in the dollar amount than the growth in revenue for our entire general fund. It's crazy. And I bring this up because a lot of the opponents of the fair tax say it doesn't solve all the state's problem, which is kind of a goofy thing to say to begin with. But we agree, the fair tax does not solve all the state's fiscal problem. There are a couple of other things the state absolutely has to do to get its fiscal house in order. One of them is to re-amortize this pension ramp, that is, flatten out the payments and create a new payment plan for it. We've designed one. It's on the next slide. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but that's one of the other things they have to do. They have to adjust their sales tax base. But flip it, the fair tax is absolutely one of the 3 or 4 most crucial things the state has to do to get its fiscal house in order. And if it doesn't get this fair tax done, it will never get its house in order. And you know, the structural deficit is going on right now. It's growing. It's much worse because of COVID-19. The model I shared with you assumed a normal economy, so we haven't adjusted it yet to determine the impact COVID-19 had on the revenue side of that model. But even if we didn't have COVID-19, our revenue's not keeping pace with our expenditures. The only way to fix that is to fix tax policy, right? And we can't fix tax policy holistically unless we get this fair tax and get our revenue system functioning in a modern economy. You know, if you're in the bottom of a hole and the structural deficit is making the hole bigger and you want to get out of the hole, the first thing you do is you stop digging. So passing the fair tax is a way to stop digging and start building our way back out of the hole. Next slide. So as I promised, this is sort of a re-amortization. The red line that squiggles across the top of that graphic, that's just the pension ramp as it exists. And this is a way to change the payment structure, still get the pension systems 72% funded. They're healthy at 80%. They're only 36, 37% funded today. So it's a real rational thing to do. It saves taxpayers $45 billion. And I only include this in here, and I'm not going to go into it in depth, to show you that there are solutions to these other fiscal problems that are rational and doable. And this, by the way, can just be done with legislation. So the bottom line is all these people saying, well, it doesn't solve all the problems, so why do it? It's a crazy argument. It's one of the 3 or 4 big essential reforms we have to do, the fair tax is, coupled with some of these other things. But if we don't do the fair tax, our structural deficit will never go away. Next slide, please. To just give you an idea of how bad just our flat tax is. If our income tax rates today were the exact same they were in the year 2000. So in the year 2000, the personal income tax was 3%. Today it's 4.95. And the corporate income tax rate was 4.8%. Today it's 7%. If they were the same today, as they were in 2000, if we never increased them, our revenue today would be about $7 or $8 billion less on an inflation-adjusted basis than it was in the year 2000. This sort of shows you how bad our tax policy is. Now, with those tax increases, we're still below where we were in the year 2000, but it's only by about 100 million. But still, we're below. We've increased our tax rates and still aren't generating revenue that grows consistently with the modern economy because we're not taxing the modern economy. So this whole part of the presentation is to let everyone know that truly Illinois' fiscal problems are driven by bad tax policy, bad revenue policy. It isn't a spending problem. It has never been a spending problem. There are no data to support the argument that it's a spending problem. We got to focus on what's causing the problem, and that is tax policy. So next slide, please. My favorite slide, my horrified taxpayer. So this is the woman I met in an elevator and said, see, our fiscal system's so bad, we got to raise taxes during a pandemic. And that was her response. And I just quickly took a picture, put it on here because I think that's presence. I'm kidding, of course. But the bottom line is when you have a structural deficit that's driven by bad tax policy, you have to raise taxes to fix it. So if you're going to raise taxes, then you need to take into account some of the challenges that tax policy has to deal with to work in a modern economy. Next slide. So the first challenge is wherever your needs are greatest, your resources are least. The truth. So your tax policy has to recognize and respond to this reality by focusing taxes on people and areas of wealth and taking some of the revenue raised there and spending it on services provided in areas of need. That for it to work, for your tax policy to work mathematically, that has to happen. And the challenge there is literally every single tax or fee charged by state or local government is regressive. What do I mean by that? I mean, it takes a greater portion of the income of a low or moderate earning family than an affluent family when you look at tax burden as a percentage of income. So every tax and fee is regressive except for possibly one, the income tax. Why? The income tax is the only tax that can be designed to focus on areas of wealth by having higher tax rates on higher levels of income and lower tax rates on lower levels of income. Indeed, it's the only tax that can be used to offset the natural regressivity of every other tax and fee available to fund public services. That's its role if you picked up a tax policy textbook, right? You would see in the textbook, your income tax is supposed to have a graduated rate structure to offset the regressivity of every other tax and fee. Well, our Constitution prohibits that in Illinois. And that's not just bad tax policy from a textbook standpoint, it's bad tax policy from a capitalist standpoint. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from Adam Smith, and it's straight out of The Wealth of Nations, the tome, and I do mean tome, a 5-volume tome that was published in 1776. America and capitalism born together, meant to be, woohoo, yay. But he invented the capitalist system, and he had something to say about how you design taxes to work in a capitalist economy. So I'm going to read this quote really quickly. I don't like reading from my PowerPoints, but it's insightful. So according to Adam Smith, the subjects of every state ought to contribute to the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Home Lord Keynes has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. Only one tax can do that, the income tax, and only if it has a graduated rate structure. Now, why did Adam say this? And the answer is actually pretty clear. Adam said, because of disproportionate bargaining power, the owners of capital, people at the top of the income ladder, had so much bargaining power over laborers that they would always, through the negotiation process, when wages are being set, those kinds of things, be able to take a portion of the value of the input to the economy being created by laborers away from the laborers and up into their pocket through bargaining power. So they would get a disproportionate share of income growth over time because of this. Disproportionate meaning greater than the value of their inputs in the economy because they're taking from others. And that's not evil or immoral, but it's how the system would work. But if that's how the system would work, then these people at the top of the income ladder ought to have the greatest tax burdens as a percentage of income to cover the public services that the government provides. Was he right? Let's test it with data. Next slide, please. So this is Illinois specific data. We did an analysis, the center did, of income tax returns filed by Illinois residents with the federal government, the IRS. And go to the comparison in the far left column. And this is the most recent data we could get comprehensively through 2017. So from 1979 through 2017, a 40-year period, basically. After you adjust for inflation, the wealthiest 1% in Illinois saw their average incomes increase from about $411,000 a year to $1.4 million a year. That's an increase over this time period of 254% after inflation in real terms. That's their real growth in income. Go to the next comparison. Everybody else, the bottom 99%, saw their average income jump from woohoo 51,000 to 61,000. That's a 20% growth. That's a half of a point per year over a 40-year sequence. It is nothing. And in fact, if I were able to put the numbers on this graphic for the bottom 90%, their incomes are negative over this period of time after you adjust for inflation. So literally, all income growth in Illinois specifically went to the wealthiest 10%, but primarily to really the wealthiest 1 or 2 or 3%. And that's what all the data show. Now, the only tax that could respond to that distribution of income growth, again, is the income tax. Every other tax and fee is regressive, so it'll take a bigger portion of a lower moderate income earner's family. The income tax, because it could assess higher rates on higher levels of income and lower rates on lower levels of income, could actually respond to the economic reality of how income gets distributed in the modern economy and focus a little tax burden at the top. And by the way, you have to do that for your tax system to raise adequate revenue. Our flat income tax prevents us from having any tax that responds to this monstrous growth in income inequality and focuses tax burden where basically economic activity, in this case income, is growing most rapidly and is greatest, and forces us to focus our tax burden everywhere else. And that's not such a good idea just from a fiscal standpoint, forget fairness, just from a raising revenue to fund services standpoint. Next slide, please. But if you do want to talk about fairness, we do have one of the most unfair taxing structures in America. And so 5th most regressive according to the research of ITEP. And so if you go to the far left and then move to the right, the bottom 20, 40, 60, 80% of taxpayers in our state all pay a greater percentage of their income in state and local taxes than do the wealthiest 1%. The reason for that? We have a flat income tax that can't offset the natural regressivity of the sales and excise and property taxes and user fees that fund government elsewhere. That's really what you see going on here. You need the income tax to offset this regressivity of every other tax and create a little bit of fairness among taxpayers, and it can only do that if it has a graduated rate structure. Next slide, please. Now, if you really want to get upset, and I hope you do, because getting upset is just fun when you're talking about tax policy. You really want to get upset, just look at the comparison in the far left here. So what we did was we just broke down income inequality before and after taxes in Illinois. So the blue bar is before, the red bar is after. So in the far left-hand column, before taxes, the wealthiest 1% in Illinois have an average income that's 137 times greater than the average income of the bottom 20%. After taxes, it's worse. So our tax system is so regressive that after taxes, the wealthiest 1% have an average income that's 149 times greater than the average income at the bottom. What? I mean, this is the opposite of what Adam Smith said ought to be done when you design a tax system. This sure isn't remedying inequality of riches by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. This is flipping that switch the wrong way around. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the fair tax proposal itself and what really is and isn't happening in November and then January. So it's a two-part process. In November, what we are voting on as constituents, residents of the state of Illinois, is whether or not the Illinois Constitution should be amended to permit a graduated rate structure. No structure is going to be built into the Constitution. In fact, under the amendment, legislators could still decide to have a flat rate system. It's just permissive. It just allows them to have a flat or graduated structure. That's it. That is what we are voting on in November. However, if that amendment gets ratified, and let's hope that it does, the rate structure that will be implemented has already been enacted and signed into law by Governor Pritzker, all that on a bipartisan basis, by the way. And this is what that rate structure looks like. And so to explain what's going on here. The marginal rate is the tax rate applied to the level of income in the specific income bracket. The income brackets are taxable income. So this is the income for a taxpayer after taking out all deductions, all credits, all exemptions. So it's not your gross income, it's a much smaller number, right? This is your tax. And then we broke it down by if you're a single filer or if you're married filing jointly. And so the 4.95 is highlighted in red here because that's our current flat rate. And what you could see they do under the structure is they have a lower rate for the first $10,000 of taxable income, and then a lower rate for the next $90,000. That is your taxable income between $10,000 and $100,000, still taxed at a lower rate. Then the current flat rate kicks in when taxable income is $100,000 and stays there up to $250,000. But mind you, that only covers that tranche. So you're still getting if you have $250,000 of income, whether you're single or married filing jointly, you still get the benefit of the lower rates on your lower levels of income, right? So you're still taxed at the lower rate on your first $10,000 and the lower rate on your next $90,000. So in effect, you're going to get a tax relief. And really, this 86%, that's to just let you know, 86% of the state's taxpayers have taxable income below $100,000. That's where 86% of the taxpayers are. And you can see where the rest of them fall on the ladder. And then the rates start kicking up when taxable income's over $250,000. You still don't end up paying more in taxes until, if you're single, your income gets to be close to $350,000, around $325,000, $350,000, in that range of taxable income. Then you actually start paying more under this proposal. And if you're married filing jointly, it's a similar number, like $350,000, $375,000. It's in that range. But the bottom line is, it's a progressive structure. It does cut taxes for most people. I want to highlight one thing. If you see the top rate at the very bottom down there of 7.99%, that is a flat rate. So if your taxable income, if you're single, is $750,000 or more, or if you're married filing jointly and your taxable income is $1 million, then you go from paying a flat rate of 4.95%, which is under current law, to a flat rate of 7.99%. There's no graduated structure for you. You don't get advantage of those lower rates. Everyone with incomes below that does. That only impacts, this flat rate jump only impacts 0.3% of the people who file tax returns in Illinois. It's the wealthiest of the wealthy. If you know some of these people, please introduce them to me so I could solicit them to make a contribution to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, which is tax deductible. Next slide, please. So is the structure a sound structure and does it work? Yes, it does. So it cuts taxes for 97% of taxpayers. Only the wealthiest 3% will pay more. In a non-COVID-19 economy, it'll raise about $3.6 billion in recurring annual revenue that will grow over time because it focuses where the income distribution is highest and growing fastest over time. That is the wealthiest 3%. In a COVID-19 economy, it's going to produce less, but not significantly less. And the reason I say that, if you look at the job destruction created by the pandemic, and 30 million Americans are collecting unemployment insurance. I mean, there's there's been some job destruction in this COVID-19 economy. 30% of the jobs in the bottom two, the two lowest paying wage quintiles, have been lost during this recession. But only 5% of the jobs in the top wage quintile have been lost. So that means that the destruction in the economy is way, way disproportionately impacting jobs at the bottom and bottom middle. And it is, although it's hurting people at the top, it's nowhere near the devastation that it's doing for the bottom and middle, which means when you focus your tax increase on the very top, yeah, it's going to raise less. They are going to be earning less. There is going to be some suffering even up there, but the bottom line is not a lot less. And our current projections are roughly 2.5 to 2.6 billion. That is very back of the envelope for a full year, maybe 1.3, 1.2 for a half a year, which is what this law will be in effect for fiscal year 2021 if it goes into effect in January. Next slide, please. Some people have highlighted, the anti-tax folks, that there is a slight marriage, well, they don't say slight, they say a massive marriage penalty in the bill. And once again, it's not so massive. So yes, there is a marriage penalty that mathematically is just the case, but it means very little, and it doesn't change the basic nature of the legislation, which is 97% of the people who are going to file a tax return are going to pay less on average than they do today. So if you go to this graphic, and I don't want to kill it too much, but 86% of the taxpayers have taxable income below 100,000, right? You see that little note on the right-hand part of the screen there. So if they are married filing jointly, for that 86% of taxpayers, they will on average get about $14.25 less in tax relief than a single person at the same level would get, on average. And they're still getting tax relief. Their taxes are going down, but by 14 bucks less than the tax relief for a single person similarly situated on average. Then for folks with taxable incomes between 100 and 250,000, they're going to get about $48 less on average in tax relief than a similarly situated single person. This is not a massive marriage penalty, and as the next slide will show you, next slide please, it's still tax relief for everyone in the bottom 97%. So the bill does what it says it would do. Next slide please. In fact, and I will have an update of this slide literally by tomorrow. We were talking with the people at ITEP, and they're going to put out a new one today. I don't know if they did or not, but we tried to get it for tonight's presentation and we couldn't. But we should have a new slide on it tomorrow. But the bottom line is the bill works. The red line shows you tax burden as a percentage of income under current law, and you can see much higher at the bottom and middle than at the top. And the blue line shows you tax burden as a percentage of income under the fair tax. And the new graphic doesn't change very much. Literally, it looks better for the wealthiest, actually. It drops down a little bit on the top, the 10.80, I think they said is going to be around 10.6 or 10.4. So the bottom line is, it's still going to look very much like this. And note, even though we're raising taxes on the wealthiest, they still have the lowest tax burdens as a percentage of income in our state after the fair tax goes into effect. And the reason for that is they have so much income and so much growth in income over time. This does not create any type of onerous burden for them whatsoever. Next slide, please. So then come the arguments all the time, well, it's going to wreck the economy. No, it won't. So there's never been a peer-reviewed study that finds a statistically meaningful correlation between your tax policy and your job growth at the state or even the federal level. I mean, the Congressional Budget Office, the Small Business Administration, we have up here, I think an institute out of the University of Missouri, the Truman Institute, but we even found Cato Institute studies, very anti-tax groups, found the same thing. Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship, very conservative, very anti-tax, found the same thing. There's just no correlation between your tax policy and economic or job growth. Other things matter more. Next slide. And then we have the real life examples of Minnesota and Kansas. Kansas got a supply sider in Governor Brownback about a decade ago, and he said literally used Kansas as the test case. We're going to really cut taxes on the wealthiest in our state. And that'll free up so much of their income to trickle down, you know this theory, right? And create jobs for everyone else, that two things will happen. Number one, even though we're cutting taxes, we're not going to have any deficits because the jobs are going to grow so much faster. All these other people will have jobs and they'll be paying taxes they wouldn't have paid otherwise. So the tax cut will pay for itself. You've heard that one, right? And then two, literally the trickle down economic impact. We'll have massive job growth. Kansas's job growth will outstrip the Midwest and the nation and blah, blah, blah. Well, he did cut taxes on the wealthiest and their economy did not take off. And in fact, their economy ended up growing a little slower than the Midwest and the nation. So obviously they had deficits because there weren't all these new people getting a benefit of the trickle down in new jobs. And their deficits got so significant they had to really cut spending. They cut spending on K-12 education so materially that the Kansas Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutionally denied Kansas school children their right to a quality education. And so they forced the legislature to restore those cuts. And then the legislature had to then pass tax increases to start paying for it. Minnesota, Governor Dayton, when he got in office, about the same time, inherited a hot mess. Bridges were collapsing everywhere. You remember reading about that in the papers, et cetera. He had a $6.2 billion deficit. Now, Illinois is about $8 billion, right? But Minnesota has a population the size of Cook County. So think about that giant deficit with such a smaller population than our state. Anyway, $6.2 billion deficit, high unemployment rate, 7%. His state economy had only created 4,000 new jobs over the prior 7 years combined, not per year, combined. So he said, look, we're not funding schools. We have a big deficit. We need capital construction programs. Our bridges are falling apart. Our infrastructure's a mess. I'm going to raise taxes. And so he did, but he did it progressively. He raised his top income tax rate from 7.85 to 9.85%. And what happened? 4 years later, Minnesota had 172,000 new jobs. Their unemployment rate was down to 3.9%, and they had a budget surplus. And so here, this really sort of shows you that the data has never supported either of these contentions. Number one, contention that if you raise taxes and you raise taxes on the wealthy, you're going to kill your economy. Or number two, if you cut taxes and cut them particularly on the wealthy, you're going to grow your economy. The data have just never supported it. This is just a couple of recent examples of real life, but they don't support it overall. And how do I know that? Next slide. So there are 41 states in America that have an income tax. 9 do not. And these 9 states that don't have an income tax are frequently referred to as the miracle economic states of the anti-tax group, right? They include Texas and Nevada and Florida and North Dakota. And they say, gee, people are flocking to those states. They have such great economies, blah, blah, blah. So we said, all right, let's see if in fact the 9 states without any income tax at all perform better economically over a long period of time, the last decade, in fact, than the 9 states in America that not only have income tax, but have the highest tax rates. So the top highest tax rate, 9 states in America. The high tax states here are in the black, the no tax states are the red. Go to the comparison in the far left. State GDP growth per capita significantly higher in the high tax states than the no tax states. Personal income growth higher in the high tax states. More important, disposable personal income growth. This is what people have after taxes. It's what they have to put in their pocket. Higher in the high tax states than the no tax states. So of course that leads to the final comparison there. Personal consumption is higher in the high tax states, and that's crucially important because the economy is driven by consumer spending. And so when consumption is higher, you have a better economy, and that partially explains why the GDP is better. Now, we are in a recession, and one of the arguments that's going to be raised against going to the fair tax is increasing taxes during a recession, particularly a significant one like the one caused by the pandemic, is a really bad idea, and it's going to hurt your economy. And the answer is it won't. And this isn't me talking. This is Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. He did a massive study of the Great Recession using data compiled by the Congressional Budget Office. And he came up with a couple of conclusions. Conclusion number one was, and this has been verified, his work is awesome, those states that raised taxes progressively during the Great Recession and maintained their spending on services rather than dealing with their fiscal problems by cutting spending on services. So they raised taxes to invest in core services, recovered quicker coming out of the Great Recession than the states that cut spending. Why? And it all gets down to consumer spending. So when you raise taxes progressively, you're raising them on really rich people. And in Illinois, the richest 3% would be the ones that would pay more under the fair tax. In economic terms, those people have what's called a very low marginal propensity to consume. All that means is with the next dollar of income they get or lose, they're unlikely to change their spending patterns. They're unlikely to spend more or spend less. Their marginal propensity to consume is low. So they already have all the money they need to spend on everything they want. So they get a little bit more money, they don't spend more. They lose a little bit of money that you take away through a tax increase, they don't spend less. In other words, by focusing your tax increase on the wealthy, you do not harm consumer spending. And since consumer spending drives 68 to 70% of all economic activity, that is good that you don't harm it. On the flip side, when you have a tax structure like the one in the fair tax that actually reduces a little bit of the income tax burden on low and moderate income families, they'll take that money and spend it because they have high marginal propensities to consume. Why? You saw the income data I presented earlier. Their incomes have been flat or declining for 40 years. So they tend to spend every penny they earn and every additional penny they earn, whether through tax relief or through a job raise, because they're trying to just maintain their standard of living because their growth in wage is insufficient to do that over time. It's that simple. A bump, according to Stiglitz, is anywhere from 30 cents to $1.50 for every dollar in tax relief they get. Similarly, because the state is raising taxes to invest in core services, and you now know 90% of those expenditures, 96%, go to education, health, social services, and public safety. What the state is really spending on it when it makes those expenditures are the wages of the workers providing those services, the teachers, the social workers, et cetera. So those are middle income folks with what? High marginal propensities to consume. So that also has a positive economic multiplier effect. And not just Stiglitz found that, Zandi found that, he's the chief economist at Moody's. So the bottom line is the tax increase that's embodied in the fair tax is precisely the right thing to do during a down economy if you want to recover quicker and allow your state to maintain its investment in core services. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just, I'm just going to do this really quickly. Another argument that is raised by the anti-tax groups is, well, it's a camel's nose under the tent. You know, once they get a graduated rate structure, they're just going to keep raising taxes willy-nilly. So while this tax increase, sure, this one's good for the middle class, they're just going to turn around and a year later raise more, and that'll hit the middle class because that's just giving them the right to raise taxes willy-nilly. Of the 41 states with an income tax, 32 have a graduated rate structure. Over the last 20 years, and this graphic shows you the data, over the last 20 years, if you were a middle income family and you lived in one of these 32 states that has a graduated rate structure, you'd have an 80% likelihood that there'd be no change in your tax rate at all. None, 80%. You'd have a 13% likelihood of getting a tax cut. This is based on what these states actually did. You'd only have a 5% chance of having a tax increase hit on you. And there's a 2% chance that your state would have increased taxes, but only on the wealthy. So that means not only is it most likely in a state with a graduated rate structure based on actual experience that no tax policy change happens, no rate change happens. But if a rate change does happen, it's more than twice as likely to be a tax cut as it is a tax increase on the middle class. And why these anti-tax groups are making these unjustifiable fear-mongering calls that it's some kind of camel's nose on a thing is beyond me, but literally there's no data that support them. Next slide, please. All right, let's jump 2, 3, 4 slides. to the one with the bars. Next slide, next slide. And we'll end here. All these are similar slides. They all get with migration. So two arguments are made. You raise taxes, people will leave. All right, I can kill that one. There's never been a peer-reviewed study that finds a statistically meaningful correlation between migration and tax policy. The reason people move from a statistically meaningful standpoint are, number one, jobs. They get a job in a different state. Number two, family. They want to be closer to family members somewhere or another. Number three, apparently, and this is going to be hard to believe for anyone who lives in Illinois, some people like nice weather, so they will move to states that have nice weather. And then number four, housing market prices. So if housing prices are particularly low in a neighboring state and you can maintain all your connections, you will move to a neighboring state to take advantage of the lower housing prices. That's it. I'm not saying no one's ever moved for tax reasons. Of course they have. People move for all kinds of crazy reasons, but on a statistically meaningful basis, it's just immaterial. Second, well, maybe most people won't move, but millionaires, boy, they can move and they will. All right, so that wasn't the experience in Minnesota when Minnesota raised its income tax on the wealthiest, but an even more extreme case was California. So in 2013, California jumped its top income tax rate from 10.3 to 13.3%, only on millionaires, on the wealthy. I think 500,000 and above. Go to 2013. A bar shows you the number of tax filers in California in 2013 who were millionaires. And then each year after is the number of millionaires in the state filing tax returns. Where's this huge migration of California millionaires out of the state? It didn't happen. It's a myth. The only study that ever found any correlation between millionaire migration and a tax increase was one done by a great researcher at Stanford University when he looked at New Jersey's millionaires tax that they paid. Now, New Jersey's unique situation because it's in that tri-state area where you could live in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, or the city of Philadelphia if you're a millionaire and still maintain all your business contacts and whatever. So you have some choices. And so if you want to play at the margins, you can move around. And what they found was, yes, millionaire migration did increase in New Jersey after they passed their millionaire tax by 0.4%. 0.4%. Ooh. But even though migration increased a barely noticeable tick, the net number of millionaires in New Jersey continued to grow. So it's not like millionaires went running, fleeing out of New Jersey. So the bottom line is, all the arguments that are being raised against a fair tax have no basis in evidence or facts, and they're tantamount to fear-mongering. All the evidence supports that this fair tax initiative is a very rational proposal. And if you just take a step back and think about tax policy, an income tax role is to offset the natural regressivity of every other tax and fee charged at the state or local level. You can only do that with a graduated rate structure. Can't have that in Illinois because of our constitutional restrictions. The other role an income tax is supposed to play is respond to how income growth is distributed in the modern economy over time. It can only do that with a graduated rate structure, particularly given the substantial growth in income inequality that's happened in our state. This is a great proposal. It makes a lot of sense. It does not solve all our problems, but it's an essential step forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, there we go. Before we get to the questions that have been submitted by league members, I'd like to ask Ralph to explain why do your figures, particularly related to the tax burden and others, differ from those shared by WirePoint's calculations?
Well, I'm not going to get into WirePoint's calculations, but I can tell you they have yet to put up something when we did review it that held up to scrutiny. These are the same folks that fund the Illinois Policy Institute, and they skew things. I just did a debate, actually, with a gentleman. He's a nice guy from WirePoint's, Ted Dabrowski. He used to work at the Illinois Policy Institute. And I'll give you an example of how they misuse data. So during the debate, he said, Illinois is I think 11th highest tax burden was the number he cited, something like that in the country. And he used as his source the tax foundation. Well, that's interesting because I know that tax foundation work. And let me start with number one. The tax foundation themselves say you cannot use their model for isolating in-state tax burden or comparing tax burden in one state to another. That's not what it even does. Here's what it does. If you live in a state, pick any state, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, whatever, they look at your income level, whatever that happens to be. And they say, all right, if you earn $50,000 a year, these are your typical consumption patterns, i.e. this is what you buy. And based on what you buy, here is what you are paying in state and local taxes to all 50 states across America, to New York, to Alaska, to Texas, because you're consuming gasoline and you're paying the severance tax in Texas, all these things. And they say, and they isolate that out, and then they rank it. And so in that ranking, Illinois ranks 11th. So the stuff we buy in Illinois nationally ranks 11th in paying taxes to other states. But it doesn't isolate your own in-state tax burden to what you're paying in your own state, to just your own state and local area. And they even say you can't use their data to make that claim, and yet he did. So I just say their data points have yet to stand up to scrutiny, and they will take stuff and use them out of context for the wrong reasons to mislead. I could give you other examples, but I mean, I'm just going to stop it there. So I don't know which thing in particular he's talking about, or she's talking about. If they want to send us that, we will tell you, we will debunk it.
Thank you very much. So now Ann Porter has been tracking questions in the chat, and
as we all know, Ann Porter is a great American.
So Ann, please share some of the questions League members have been asking.
Okay, great. First of all, we've been getting a lot of congratulations and thanks for Ralph's presentation. So I just want to pass that along, and people really appreciated it. One thing that would be easy to clear up, there's some confusion about how taxes can be raised. Who gets to raise taxes, and will that change if the fair tax passes?
No, it's the same process as we have today, Ann, right? I mean, they could raise, they will have the same authority to raise taxes after this amendment is ratified as they do now. Nothing changes the authority of the legislature or the governor to raise taxes. The only thing that's changed is the form of the tax increase. Right now, if they raise taxes with the income tax, everyone has to pay the same tax rate. So someone working at McDonald's has to pay the same tax increase as someone that's a millionaire. What this Constitution will permit is a graduated rate structure so that when they raise taxes in the future, they could actually do it in a way that doesn't sock it to low and middle income families and just focuses at the top. So no new authority is created whatsoever. Just the design of the tax increase can be a little more compassionate and comport with ability to pay.
Great. There were a lot of questions about the pensions, as there always are. You have proposed a possible solution, a way to re-amortize the pension debt. What is the status of that proposed solution?
You know, it has a lot of support, and it almost actually got enacted in the last year of Governor Rauner. We had 15 or 16 Republicans working on a bipartisan basis behind the scenes with a larger number of Democrats that were all ready to, we had a bill, they were all ready to push it. Governor Rauner indicated he would sign it. And then at the last minute, he pulled his support away, so the Republicans peeled off, so it didn't happen. And right now, you know, we haven't been down in Springfield talking it. We have consistent champions of that legislation, but with the pandemic and with the focus on the fair tax, we have been focused on the fair tax. When November comes around, we will go back to, you know, our legislative leaders that have supported re-amortization. Will Davis, for instance, who's in leadership in the House, is one of our big supporters on this legislation. and try to make it happen. And we've had numerous conversations with the governor and the governor's folks on it. And there are certainly aspects of it they very much like.
There's a question that just popped up. Why are we seeing commercials that say farmers are opposed to this tax?
Well, because the Farm Bureau does oppose it, and for no good reason. But that's why you're seeing the commercials. They can do it because the Farm Bureau opposes it. Farmers are not going to be hit hard by this at all. They're not going to be hit by this at all. I mean, this is a tax that mostly hits Cook and the Collar counties, really, if you look at where the concentration of the most affluent people are. This is a great bill for downstate Illinois because remember my little graphic on wherever your needs are greatest, your resources are least. There's a very low level of income in most downstate communities. And so some of the tax revenue that will be raised in Cook and the Collar counties will actually get spent downstate helping their communities prosper. So this is a great bill for downstate. I can't tell you why the Farm Bureau is against it, but they are against it. They also were against the estate tax, even though, and Ann, I think you remember this back in the day when we were working on this stuff together, when the American Farm Bureau testified against continuing the estate tax at the federal level because all these family farms would be lost, they were asked, can you identify one? And they couldn't. So there's more myth than reality driving that, I think.
Right. Another area of myth involves retirement income. Can you address that?
Oh, Ann, thank you. I should have, actually talked this one. Thank you for answering the question, asking the question. All right, so here's all you need to know, although I'm going to go beyond this, of course, because I'm Martire, so I talk a lot. Have you ever heard of the ARP, the AARP? You ever heard of them? They oppose taxing retirement income, right? At any level. They are fully on board with the fair tax. They 100% support the fair tax, and they're pushing it. If ARP is pushing it, you could rest assured retirement income isn't taxed. It's just sort of a given. Now let's talk about it. There is nothing in this legislation that expands any legal authority to tax retirement income beyond where it is today. In fact, the only reason retirement income isn't taxed in Illinois today is Illinois legislatively decoupled from the taxation of retirement income that's done at the federal level by statute. It is a statute that allows people to deduct all their retirement income in Illinois. That's it. If Illinois ever wants to change that, they change the statute. Nothing in this constitutional amendment deals with that statute. Nothing in the fair tax legislation deals with that statute. In other words, the constitutional change doesn't tax retirement income. The fair tax doesn't tax retirement income, the legislation, and neither of those things create any additional legal authority whatsoever to tax retirement income. But I'm going to say one more thing about it. If they don't get the fair tax, you saw the structural deficit. They're going to have to look at everything. And my guess is if they don't get the fair tax in 2 or 3 years, will look at retirement. So I think passing the fair tax is one of the best ways to ensure they never look at retirement income because they really do need the revenue, right? It's just all those arguments are crazy town.
Yeah. Another question that we have is, how does Illinois spending compare to other states?
Well, overall, we're one of the lower spending states in America. So on a per capita basis, we're down in the low 30s. And as a percentage of GDP, we're even below that. So the bottom line is we have the 6th largest state from a population standpoint. We have the 5th largest state from an economic standpoint. We're bottom 3rd in spending. We are bottom half in tax burden as a percentage of income, according to the Federation of Tax Administrators, which they have no modeling, right? They just say, here's all your taxes and fees at the state and local level. Here's your personal income according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Divide the one by the other. There's your tax burden as a percentage of income, state and local. So we're bottom half there. So we're low tax, we're low spending. We don't meet demographically driven need. We can't afford to even maintain our current low levels of spending. We need the new revenue.
So would it be fair to say that we have not overspent since the 1970s?
Yeah, no. I mean, and if that one graphic, it's like the 2nd or 3rd slide I showed, right, where our actual spending on services this year after inflation is 20% lower than it was 2 decades ago under Governor George Ryan. No.
Okay, we've got, pensions just won't lie down. Why did the governor not push for a constitutional question to be on the ballot to address the pension clause that is there and to reduce future costs?
I would say because the governor's rational. So, and why do I say that? So let me answer that question. Number one, hopefully when I showed that pension ramp slide, it was very clear to everyone, pension benefits aren't driving this problem. It's the structure of the debt service passed in 1995 in the ramp. If all we had to do was fund benefits, we wouldn't be talking about state pension. Because our pension costs are literally at the national average of benefits. And now they actually might have dropped below because of tier 2. Tier 2 is such a lower benefit than tier 1 was. So it's not a benefit-driven problem, number one. Number two, even if you got a constitutional change that took away the protection, under the U.S. law, although with our current president, maybe U.S. constitutional law doesn't matter, but under U.S. constitutional law, you cannot take anyone's constitutional right away what's called ex post facto, meaning looking back. So if they did get a constitutional amendment on the ballot and it did pass, that would only impact new hires that come on board after the constitutional amendment was ratified, meaning you can't reduce the existing liability by 1 penny. It cannot do it. Why would you jump through all those hoops and expense of going through a constitutional amendment when you could pass a new tier 3 to reduce benefits now for new hires? So it's sort of why doesn't the governor push for it? Because he's rational. It doesn't help to get this done. It doesn't address the problem. It can't be used to reduce the existing cost. And it only would impact people going forward, which they could already do legislatively. I don't get it.
Okay, so maybe just a couple more questions. One might be related to the property taxes. We've heard that there's been a lot of pressure put on property taxes by inadequate funding for education. And the question is, how will we ensure that property taxes will go down?
Well, they won't immediately. So I don't sell snake oil. They will go down, but they're not going to go down until it would take a good 4 to 5 years of the state funding the evidence-based formula at around 350 to 400 million a year. And at that point, you would see a tipping point. We've done some modeling at the center where local school districts would be able to start providing tax relief and lowering things, and tax burden will flatten out. And in fact, in our state, we have the only statistically meaningful correlation between the level of state investment in K-12 and property taxes. And so I'm very confident that once the state starts making this investment and it is sustained over a 4 to 5 year period, property taxes will flatten out and go down. In fact, it's the only way to sustainably bring down property tax burden in Illinois. There's no other rational way to do it. And a property tax freeze would be devastating to schools, because you saw on the graphic, 67% of education is funded by local property taxes, and the overall system is underfunded by $7 billion. So if we just froze that right now, we would be denying not just low-income children generally, but Black and brown children specifically, any chance to get adequate funding for their schools. So we really need, it's a long-term problem and it requires a long-term solution. This isn't a happy answer, but once again, I'm not here to sell snake oil. I'm here to tell the truth. And the truth of the matter is property taxes will come down, but not immediately. It'll take 4 or 5 years.
Okay. In addition to reducing the pressure on property taxes, we've heard that the fair tax will provide additional funding for those core services, the education, the human services, and other current needs. How much of the revenue, though, needs to go to the pension obligations? Well,
they need to re-amortize the pension debt. I mean, too much of it, honestly, Ann. I mean, too much of it. You saw that ramp. I mean, it takes more than all the revenue growth now. So it would take too much of the tax increase, and it's stupid to just take so much and throw it away on debt service when you could have a debt service plan that actually brings the pension systems to health for a much lower cost to taxpayers. So that's why the fair tax doesn't solve all problems. You need to do the reamortization. And Ann, I know you know this. We need to expand our state sales tax base to include consumer services. There's a couple things we need to do, but this fair tax is one of them. So we get this arrow in the quiver, and then I think we focus on reamortizing the pension debt, and then the final step would be the sales tax in a couple of years.
So what percent of the vote do we need to pass this thing?
3/5. Okay, so it's a double test. As you know, you could actually answer this question. We need 3/5 of the people who vote on the amendment to vote in favor of it, or 50% who vote in the general election to vote in favor. So it's a double test. The polling data, and I am on the steering committee for one of the ballot initiative groups that's out there. The polling data that we are seeing now has us right in the margin of error. So depending on the day, it's 58%, 62%, 59%, 61%. We're in the margin of error. So it's literally every vote's going to matter on this one, and it's going to come right down to the wire.
Yeah, I'm on the steering committee for the other ballot committee, and we're seeing similar results for our polls. So we really do need every possible vote.
Every vote.
Yes. It should be at the top of your ballot. And if you don't see it, go look for it, because it will be there, and we need a yes vote. Okay. Is there any other last minute thing that you'd like to do to wrap this up? Jean or Ralph?
Okay. Thank you, Ralph, for appearing tonight. We're grateful for you taking time out of your busy schedule to address the League of Women Voters community. And thank you to our League members and friends of the League for staying engaged and informed. If your question wasn't answered, we'll try to provide an answer in the future, so please send it to issues@lwvil.org. Again, thank you very much.